So obviously we're here in North Carolina. We're headed to Omaha. But look, our message today was, look, we could actually have a much better national security policy if we just had a better change in leadership. And I think President Trump, the contrast between the accusation that he was this cowboy that was going to start nuclear war and 4 years where we had relative peace and stability all across the world, it's just really important to remind the American people that we could have that again. We just have to have better leadership. The final point that I'll make is, look, I mean, we're now, I guess this is Tim Walz's big day at the DNC. It is shocking to me that the entire argument of the Harris campaign is basically collective amnesia. They're trying to convince the American people that she hasn't been vice president for 3.5 years, while she's been a linchpin of some of the policies that have driven up the cost of groceries, driven up the cost of food, and driven up the cost of housing. So we just have to remind people she is actually the vice president right now, as much as she's trying to run from her own record. Happy to take a few questions.
Today, obviously, a conversation we had about national security. Part of that is immigration. It's expected that a San Antonio sheriff is expected to speak on immigration and slam Republicans for Donald Trump for blocking that border deal. Senator Langsford was a big supporter of that. Obviously, he co-authored it. How do Americans look at Republicans seriously on this issue if you guys block this process?
Well, you know, it's interesting. So Jim Lankford's a good friend and he's a good guy. And if you look at throughout that process, one of the things that Jim Lankford said is that he was trying to push this bill to force the Harris administration to do its job. He admitted at the outset, this is not a necessary piece of legislation. We're trying to find a way to force their hand. And really the disagreement between Lankford and everybody else, and of course the gross majority of the Republican conference opposed it, is we just said this is actually not going to force the administration's hand. They're going to be able to weasel their way out of real immigration enforcement. And what we're giving to the Democrats, on the other hand, is actually going to make the border crisis worse. So it's really preposterous for Kamala Harris to say we needed this border bill when she started out the administration with suspending deportations, suspending the president's remain in Mexico policy. They did this thing, and no amount of legislation is going to undo the fact that unless you have a president who's willing to enforce the border, you're not going to have real border security. So Kamala Harris needs to do her job. They need to fess up to the fact that they undid a lot of good President Trump policy, and because of it, we have a wide open southern border. Even if that bill had passed, and even if it had done everything the Democrats would have said that it would do, which of course is preposterous, but even if the Democratic argument was right, they're fundamentally saying we need to give Joe Biden new tools when he showed a total lack of willingness to use those tools, and Kamala Harris was right there every step of the way.
Trump has no moral has mocked his supporters. What's your take on some of the Republicans that are going to
Well, look, I think every convention, whether it's Republican or Democrat, they find some member of the opposite party that is actually very frustrated with their former party. I think it's much more telling that you have somebody like Tulsi Gabbard, who of course was a Democrat on the debate stage 4 years ago, criticizing Kamala Harris and actually endorsing Donald J. Trump's leadership. If you look at what the modern Democratic Party has become under Kamala Harris, they don't believe in border enforcement. They don't believe in common sense economic policies. They don't believe in making housing affordable. They've just completely run away from their old base. And so I think if you look at the crossover vote, we're going to get a lot more Democrats on our ticket than I think you're going to have Republicans voting for Kamala Harris.
It's been just over a month now that there was, of course, the rhetoric attempt on President Trump's wife back in Pennsylvania. I'm curious if you think, we're a month and a half out from that now or so. Has the temperature of the political rhetoric dropped enough? Has it dropped at all? I'm curious on what you think.
Well, I think it's dropped a little bit, in part because of Donald Trump's leadership, right? I mean, he had every right to stand up after he was shot in the ear and get really pissed off and blame the Democrats, and what he instead did was call for national calm and national unity. I think to the extent the temperature has been dropped at all, it's been because of Donald Trump, which again, people accuse him of being a cowboy, but he responded to that moment with a remarkable amount of clarity and calm. Look, I do think that Democrats recognize that when you say that the guy is an existential threat to American democracy, sometimes that means crazy people are going to take actions into their own hands. And so even the Democrats have toned it down a little bit. Unfortunately, yesterday at the convention, I feel like maybe they were starting to ramp up the rhetoric back up. So I hope that they remember when you tell the American people that this guy must be stopped at all costs, most people are going to respond to that reasonably. Some people are going to take crazy actions and take matters in their own hands. So I encourage my Democrat friends to maybe pump the brakes a little bit on the apocalyptic rhetoric around Donald Trump.
Previously, has the RFK leaders been drop out on Friday and lose the American fund? Have you been part of those conversations? Have you spoken with RFK leaders?
I don't know if that's true. I have no reason to question ABC's reporting. I haven't been directly involved in those conversations. I've certainly been making publicly the argument to RFK and maybe privately to some of his supporters that the party, the Democratic Party of John F. Kennedy, has been replaced by the Open Borders Party of Kamala Harris. So I'm very hopeful that RFK will eventually endorse President Trump, but I haven't yet talked to him personally, and I don't know if that's going to happen.
Do you think that changes the trajectory of the race?
Well, it's a big thing, right? I mean, you have a guy who ran for the Democratic primary, who dropped out of that primary because it was so biased and so rigged in favor of a guy, Joe Biden, who eventually dropped out of the race himself, and who I think really represents, the most famous name in American politics, Democrat or Republican, is the Kennedy name. And I think there are a lot of socially moderate or socially conservative Democrats who feel like the party's left them behind. RFK certainly represents that. And the other thing RFK represents is a real emphasis on medical freedom. It's sort of hard for a lot of Americans to remember, but 3 years ago, Kamala Harris and Joe Biden were kicking Americans out of the military because they refused to take a COVID shot. That was a crazy period that I don't think we want to go back to, and I think RFK maybe reminds people that we actually can respect people's medical freedom while having reasonable public health policy. And unfortunately, like so many other issues, Democrats have kind of jumped the shark on the public health stuff.
What did you think of the Obama speeches last night?
I didn't watch all of it. I actually didn't watch most of it. But look, they're both very gifted speakers, and they're people who can drive a message. What I thought was interesting about it is that Kamala Harris wasn't there, right? Like, why? You have probably the most popular person in the Democratic Party, the former president of the United States, I guess before Joe Biden, the last Democratic president. Like, why wasn't Kamala Harris there? To me, it suggests that there is still some hurt feelings between the Biden wing of the party and the Obama wing of the party. Because look, the Obamas basically threw the guy out of the Oval Office and prevented him from running for president again. He's clearly pissed off about it, meaning Biden is clearly pissed off about it. And I think Kamala Harris, out of respect for Biden, decided not to show up. But it suggests there's still some hurt feelings in that party.
Okay, well, in fact,
I think that there are enough people who are a little creeped out that the President of the United States was forced out of the office by Nancy Pelosi, Barack Obama, and a few billionaires. I think that's weird. I think it's a threat to democracy much more than anything Donald Trump has ever done. And I think there are at least a few voters who are